Chapter 27. Light Fingers. Dylan wiped the sleep from his eyes as he tried to concentrate on the parchment he was currently examining on the table in front of him in the Vatican archives. He'd had very little sleep the night before, and his night of passion was now beginning to take its toll. Much of his body now ached. In fact, he seemed to have aches in places that he didn't think could ache. Carla had taken him to places of sheer bliss. In fact, she had totally broken him both mentally and physically. This morning, it was made even worse by the fact that every time he looked up and caught sight of her, she always seemed to be in some kind of alluring pose, causing him to flash back to moments of lust from the night before. He was hoping that the parchment he was examining would give him a better idea of where the Black Dragon scroll now resided within the extensive collections in the Vatican archives. Alas, after several minutes of careful study, this again turned out to be a dead end. Just a reference to where it had been stored about 20 years previous, and since then the archives had undergone an extensive refurbishment, resulting in a recategorization and redistribution of the collections. It literally was like looking for a needle in not one, but hundreds of haystacks. Letting out a large sigh of disgruntled resignation, he decided to go and seek the help of Father Ignacio. If anybody knew where the document was, or when it had last been seen, it would be the head curator. Father Ignacio was busily restoring a German Bible from the 16th century when Dylan entered his study. "Ah, Professor Hart. How is your research progressing? I trust you have everything that you require," the Padre said, whilst continuing to restore some of the gold leaf on the cover of the Bible. "Well, I was hoping you may be able to help me, Father. There is one document that, try as I might, I just can't seem to locate. The Black Dragon scroll. I was hoping that you might know where it has been stored, or where it was last seen." The mention of the scroll had clearly sparked something in Father Ignacio's mind, as no sooner than the name of it was mentioned, Father Ignacio raised one bushy eyebrow, and his normally friendly demeanour seemed to close down slightly. "Are you sure that is the document you are looking for?" "Yes, it's a crucial piece of evidence for my paper." "Interesting. Very interesting. It seems to be very popular of late. Only a few weeks ago a gentleman who has often visited our archives requested to see the very same document. In which case, it may be that it has not been replaced and could still be in conservation. We normally take recently viewed documents into the conservation labs after they've been used, just to ensure their condition. I'll phone the lab and ask and see if it's still there. If it is, I'll find out whether it would be possible for it to be brought up for you." "That would be very kind of you. Now I wish I'd asked you earlier. I've been searching the archives high and low for days without any luck." "Sometimes fortune favours those who seek help," the Padre said with a smile. Father Ignacio telephoned down to the lab and was told that the scroll was indeed still in the lab, and that it could be brought up to the main archives within the hour for Professor Hart to study. "Thank you, Father. You've been a great help." "You're very welcome, my son. I am always here to help. I do beg that when you do publish, I hope you will treat our humble institution with respect." "I don't think you need to worry, Father. My paper isn't going to bring the church down. I'm not planning on being the next Professor Langdon," Dylan replied, trying to hide his amusement at his little quip. before leaving the study of the aging padre and making his way back through security and into the archives. "Have you had any success, babe?" Carla asked as Dylan returned to the desk, piled high with books and scrolls that he'd been using as his base of study. "Yes, indeed I have. Father Ignacio has located the scroll, so now my studies can continue and hopefully result in something groundbreaking." "Good, I'm so glad for you, babe," she said, beaming at him. Her open display of happiness wasn't totally because he had found what he'd been looking for, but it also meant that she, too, was closer to her endgame. It only took about 20 minutes for the scroll to arrive from the conservationists, but to Dylan it seemed like the longest 20 minutes in the world. Time always seemed to pass at its own rate when one wanted it to fly by. The scroll was far longer and more ornate than Dylan was expecting. Gold and black dragons had been painstakingly painted onto the parchment, and the Emperor's black dragon seal was clearly visible at the bottom of the document. All the characters had been hand-painted, which made the document that much more impressive. Dylan's ancient Mandarin was a little rusty, so it was going to take a few sessions of study to fully understand all of its meanings. At least he now had it for study. "Don't forget we're guests at the Vatican's annual Christmas party this evening, so don't get too absorbed with your study, babe." "I won't. Just give me some time to make a start on it. Can you find out if the last person to view it has left a copy of their notes? Sometimes people do, so that others can have the benefit of their observations and opinions." "Sure, babe. What was their name?" Professor Peter Middleton, from what Father Ignacio was saying." Carla had a double take at the mention of the name, but managed to hide her surprise well. "Are you sure that he said Middleton?" "Yeah, pretty sure. Why? Do you know him?" Trying to cover her slip, she replied, saying, "No, not personally, but I recognise the name. Doesn't he specialise in the study of the Knights of the Temple?" "Actually, I'm not sure exactly what his speciality is, but I think he has dedicated some time to the Templars. I believe he was always a bit of outspoken on certain things, and became a recluse years ago. So I must admit I was a little surprised when Father Ignacio mentioned his name. It will be interesting to see what his notes say, if he has left a copy." This new development was of some concern for Carla. She had been aware that the old man had caused the glove some problems in the past, and he was by far the most informed person with regards to the Liber Veritatis. It was vexing that he had managed to make the link between the Codex and the Black Dragon Scroll before the glove. By the time they left the archives, Dylan had translated about a quarter of the scroll, most of which had been made up of all the titles of the Pope and the Emperor, a very long-winded greeting which was typical of the style used during the period. Carla returned with what she had managed to find of Professor Middleton's notes, but they weren't that straightforward to read, as the wily old man had encrypted them with some sort of cipher, which could take some time to break. "I've only managed to find these 2 pages of his notes, if you can call them that," she said, waving the 2 A5 pieces of paper in front of Dylan. "I see what you mean. That isn't any kind of shorthand that I've seen before. Looks like he used his own notation system, which means that they're almost useless unless one knows what all the symbols stand for. Shame. I should have liked to have had his insight into the scroll." Carla sneaked some photos of the notes whilst Dylan wasn't looking. He may not be able to understand them, but she would send them to Victor. He had a contact that had spent quite some time as a codebreaker for the Italian Secret Service, so no doubt, given time, he would be able to decipher the notes. The evening was unexpectedly mild for the time of year, especially as one would have anticipated the temperature to drop sharply due to the absence of cloud in the night sky. Carla and Dylan rejoined each other just a few streets down from St. Paul's Square and walked arm in arm down toward the side entrance of the Vatican, which was being used as the guest entrance for the Christmas party. After passing through the security check carried out by the Swiss Guard, they were escorted through the long passages ornately decorated with brightly coloured frescoes and murals. Huge paintings by some of the most famous painters like Raphael and Bernini hung in gilded frames along the walls between the magnificent frescoes. Dylan would have liked to have paused to take some time to appreciate the artwork, but then he would have lost the escort and would never have been able to find his way through the vast complex to where the party was being held. Taking a few twists and turns off from the main passageway, they entered one of the most ornately decorated parts of the Vatican. The room was vast, with ceilings that seemed to stretch on forever. Like much of the rest of the sacred building, it was decorated to such a degree that one could only stand and marvel at the scenery, and attempt to appreciate the enormity of the projects and time that must have been spent in its creation. Victor was already somewhere in the room, but luckily he had not spotted the couple enter, something for which Carla was extremely glad of, as she didn't want to have her evening spoilt right from the off. The room was full of dignitaries, celebrities and elite families of Rome, not to mention all the senior members of the clergy, dressed in all their finery. A number of refreshment tables had been set up throughout the room, although most of the guests were just taking drinks from the wandering waiters. The chatter and laughter of the guests reverberated around the room. It was at about 7:45. The guests were invited to briefly move out of the room to the terraced courtyard, from which they could watch the fireworks display that was about to start, which would also coincide with the arrival of the Pope himself. The brilliant, colourful flashes of the fireworks igniting high above St. Peter's Basilica set the clear winter's night sky ablaze. Passion pinks, bright ruby reds, and emerald greens were just some of the colours of the scintillating display that could be seen far above the ancient architecture. It was a captivating evening of both light and sound. The high-pitched whines, snap, crackle and pops of some of the more entertaining rockets filled the air. It was almost like listening to a batch of popcorn on steroids bursting inside a microwave. The temperature had clearly begun to drop, as a number of the female guests returned back inside before the display had finished. Their evening dresses were not suitable for standing out in the cold night air for too long, and they had not had the foresight to collect their warm jackets and furs before they had left the warmth of the party. Even Carla was beginning to feel the chill, but she just nestled herself deeper into Dylan's side to keep warm. The final flurry of rockets bursting into the gloomy canvas of the dark night sky heralded the Pope's arrival. As His Eminence's bulletproof glass-covered cavalcade slowly came to a halt, the Swiss Guard smartly sprung into action and lined a walkway from the car to the terrace. They almost looked like tin soldiers in their pristine yellow and blue striped uniforms and shiny halberds. The ageing Pope would not stay for long at the event. His deteriorating health would not permit it. This would also be one of his last public appearances as Pope. He was due to step aside within the next few weeks. Normally a Pope was elected for life, but it had become increasingly clear that his health was limiting his ability to carry out his duties, and he had therefore taken the decision that for the greater good and benefit of the Church, that he loved so dearly, a new, younger man should take his place, something that had not happened for many centuries. Returning to the warmth of the party, it was not long before Dillon ended up in deep conversation with a cardinal from Seville. Carla had left Dillon in deep conversation with the cardinal and headed off to one of the refreshment tables. She didn't know the man standing in front of her, but she had taken an instant dislike to him already, making her mind up that he wasn't very pleasant, and had nicknamed him the obnoxious bottle of champagne. He clocked her as he walked off to take the champagne and glasses over to his fellow guests, before returning almost immediately and rudely saying to the barman, "That's smoked old whiskey you do, same as last time. Oh, and whatever she's having," indicating Carla, whom he had almost barged past in his haste to place the order. "Don't waste his money. He can't afford me," Carla bluntly said to the barman. The barman sniggered slightly before he replied, "Scusami, ragazza, but it's a free bar tonight." "I know. I just can't stand arrogance," she replied as she took 2 glasses of red wine that she had ordered, and deliberately ignoring the obnoxious bottle of champagne's lame attempt at a retort, proudly strode off to rejoin Dillon and the cardinal. "The problem I see, Cardinal, is that in today's world, because of the speed of communication and that everybody's lives are now so full, the Christian message just doesn't seem to have the same impact in developed countries that it once did," Dillon said as Carla rejoined their conversation. "Oh, thanks, hon," he added as he took a glass of wine from her. "In part I agree with you. Certainly the Church has not adapted as quickly as it needs to for the speed at which society has changed over the last 50 years. But I disagree that its message isn't having an impact, or that it has lost its relevance. If anything, it is more important than ever. The instability in the world today and the gap between rich and poor is now so vast that I think the Church has a vital role to play in reminding people of moral values and ensuring those in need are not forgotten. If we do not, I fear we are in danger of losing touch with our humanity." "I didn't intend to cause any offence, and I hope that you are right." "None taken, my son. It is refreshing to be able to have an intellectual conversation with somebody who clearly recognises the challenges of the modern age that faces the Church away from all the politics." The wandering touch of a hand against Carla's waist drew her attention momentarily away from the conversation. Had she not been in public, she would have snapped all of Victor's sausage-like fingers before he would have realised what was happening. But she managed to resist the urge. "Victor, how good to see you," she said in such a way that if one weren't listening very carefully, you would have almost missed the briefest hint of disdain in her voice. "Allow me to introduce His Excellency the Cardinal of Seville and Professor Dillon Hart." "An absolute pleasure to meet both of you. Especially you, Professor Hart. I hear you've had quite the effect on our Miss Adams here." "You'll have to tell me your secret one day," Victor added in his oiliest fashion. If I may beg your indulgence for a little while, gentlemen, I must just steal the lovely lady away from you for a brief moment or two. As long as you promise to bring her back. She is by far the most interesting person here, replied the Cardinal, who was well known for appreciating the beauty of the flesh, slightly more than one in his position probably should. Please excuse me, Your Excellency. I'm sure this will not take long, Carla said as she stepped away from the group and accompanied Victor to a quieter part of the room. Victor, what are you doing? You know full well we should not be seen together unless absolutely necessary. I bring word from his lordship. Since your discovery that Professor Middleton has already viewed the Black Dragon scroll, he has requested that you make all haste to recover the artifact from the Vatican by any means. I had a feeling he would, and I have already taken steps to gain access to the vaults. Tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity, as the guards will all be occupied with the guests and protecting the Pope, that they probably won't be that attentive to their other duties, Carla said, flicking her long hair back from her shoulders. Well, you'll have to act fast in that case, my dear. I don't think that His Holiness will be staying for much more than the hour. Keep Dylan entertained for a while. It shouldn't be too hard, even for you, Carla said before she quietly left the room and began to wind her way through the maze of corridors towards the entrance that led down into the vaults. Just as she had expected, the corridors were devoid of guards. Using a small compact mirror from her evening purse to look around the final corner to see where the two guards were positioned at the entrance to the vaults, she knew she would have to use all of her guile and seductive charm to talk them into allowing her access at such a late stage in the evening. She took out a small vaporizer which contained some very powerful pheromones and lightly sprayed both sides of her neck before casually walking around the corner to engage the two men. The two guards, who had been on duty for a few hours, stiffened as they saw Carla's familiar sultry figure approaching. They had seen her a few times before with Dylan, so they were not taken too much by surprise at her sight. Buonasera, signorina, one of the two guards said warmly. You know it is a little late for access to the vaults now. Buonasera, signor. I realize it's late, but I have a small problem that I hope you lovely gentlemen may be able to help me with. I've realized that I left my phone on a bookshelf in the vault, and I was hoping that you might allow me access to retrieve it. I really shouldn't. The Vatican has quite a strict policy on when people are allowed into the vaults. Not even just for me? Just this once? I promise. It will be our little secret, she replied, smiling sweetly at him. I'll have to check with Father Ignacio. He will have to okay it. I shouldn't bother him if I was you. When I left him, he seemed to be deep in conversation with one of the Brazilian cardinals. I don't think he would appreciate the interruption. You can escort me if you like, she added, as she lightly ran a hand down the sleeve of his uniform. I'm sure the three of us could work something out. I expect it gets very lonely just standing here for hours. The guards passed a knowing look between each other as they took her implication on board. It is possible, maybe, but you'll have to be quick. And with that they swiped her into the vaults. Once inside, she did not take long to locate the Black Dragon scroll where she had left it earlier that day. She removed what looked like one of those e-cig vaporizers from her purse. In fact, although it did work, the main cylindrical battery compartment was empty. It was designed to be able to take rolled documents through customs without being discovered, and would be perfect for removing both the scroll and the 2 pages of Professor Middleton's notes without the guards suspecting. She removed the scroll from the short piece of bamboo it was rolled around, and after rolling up the notes, stuffed them all into the cylinder. "Have you found your phone, Signorina?" the guard asked, just as she placed the e-cig back into her purse. "Yes, thank you. Here it is. Honestly, I'm so forgetful sometimes," she replied, lifting her phone up from the shelf that she had deliberately left it on. "Now, about your reward." Dylan noticed Carla re-entering the reception room as he was about to leave Victor to go and look for her. She had been absent long enough that he had started to become concerned that she might have grown bored of the party and left without him. "For a moment I thought you might have left." "Don't be silly, babe. I wouldn't leave without you," she replied, softly brushing her lips against his neck. "I just bumped into someone outside that I hadn't seen for a very long time, and we just got chatting." Speaking of leaving, do you feel like finding a more intimate locale?" Dylan didn't need to be asked twice. Leaving the party, they strolled off arm in arm into the night. The continuous blaring of his phone on the nightstand was the first thing that Dylan was vaguely aware of when he awoke the next day. His head felt as heavy as if he had drunk an entire case of vodka the night before. Strange, because he didn't remember drinking that much at the party, or afterwards once they'd left and he'd gone back with Carla. Turning over in the bed, he realised that he was alone. He assumed that Carla must have risen earlier and didn't want to wake him. The phone rang off before he could answer it. He was shocked when he picked it up and saw that it was almost 12 o'clock. Surely he couldn't have been that tired, he thought to himself. He had over half a dozen missed calls from Father Ignacio. Wiping the sleep from his eyes, he tried to compose himself. His mouth was as dry as the desert, and his head was pounding. Whatever Father Ignacio wanted, it must be of some importance, so once he was a bit more alert, he rang the Padre back. "Good afternoon, Father. I see you've been trying to get hold of me. Sorry, I've only just seen your missed calls." "Good is not the term I would use, Professor Hart. The Vatican has been robbed. The Black Dragon scroll is missing. We would very much appreciate it if both you and Miss Adams would come into the Vatican, as you were the last people to view the scroll." "I hope you're not suggesting that we had anything to do with it, Father." "At this stage it's just routine, but we cannot rule out the possibility." "Well, we will certainly give you as much assistance as possible. We'll be there as soon as we can." Dylan hung up. His mind was now a mess of thoughts. "Carla?" he shouted from the bedroom. There was no reply. Dylan quickly dressed and hurried downstairs to see where she was. He searched the whole villa, but couldn't find her. She had vanished along with all of her things. "Oh, Carla, what have you done?" he thought, as it dawned on him that she may have taken it and left him floundering in the bathwater. It was several hours later that Dylan was finally allowed to leave the head of security's office at the Vatican. He felt absolutely drained. They had questioned him until his head felt numb. There was really very little information that he could give them about the girl that he had employed as his assistant, and they took a great deal of convincing that he had not known what she was up to. He felt utterly dejected. His clearance to the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum had been revoked, and he was very likely to never get it back, which meant that his thesis now lay in tatters. He was a broken man.